and have a chat. Thank you for joining us. There's not a huge number of us because we've done one in the daytime today, but this is going to be recorded just so anybody knows for any questions that they might ask at the end. And so we will get started. A quick intro for those that don't know me. I'm Cheryl Johns. I run LiveryList and the Yard Owner Hub. LiveryList is a livery yard directory, but more importantly, the Yard Owner Hub is an industry resource for yard owners, whether it's livery yards, riding schools, equestrian centres, and we try to help support all aspects, whether it's practical or administrative, of yard management. And that includes management of grazing, which is why we're joined by the lovely Annabel this morning, who's going to talk us about all things grazing management. Just a few bits of housekeeping before Annabel introduces herself. Like I said, if we can have cameras and microphones off, that makes it easier for us to have less disruptions. If you want to get a pen and paper, if you want to note anything down, that's great. I will be sending out the recording to everybody that's signed up anyway, along with some supplementary resources and links that might be helpful from myself and Annabel as well. What else was I going to say? I've completely lost the plot already. Yes, there will be a question and answer session at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat in the meantime. There is a button probably at the bottom of your screen where you can type any questions in as we're chatting. If it's something that's not covered by mine and Annabel's conversation, then we can ask it at the end. Or obviously I'll put Annabel's contact details in the final email that I'll send out so that anybody can contact her directly if they have any specific questions or wish to find out more about the services. So if I pass you over to Annabel to introduce herself and give you a bit of background about who she is and what she does, and then we will get on with our conversation.
Oh, thanks, Cheryl. Yes, so I'm Annabel. I'm from Equine Ecology, and I help horse owners all over the UK and all over the world manage their land in a way that benefits the horse and the land. So my background is in ecology and a bit of horse behaviour, and I kind of squished the two together, and Equine Ecology was born. And yeah, so I've been doing it for a few years now, and seeing amazing results all over the country. So hopefully I can help you in this little snippet of a chat that we can do.
Okay, that's great. So Annabel, before we start, just give us a bit of background about how you got to where you are now and what was it that drove you towards specialising in the management of equine land.
Yeah. So I grew up on a nature reserve, which obviously teared me up very well to be an absolute nature geek. I studied ecology at university, but I was also very horsey in quite a horsey area. And my career took me all over the country, and I kept horses in all kinds of different places. So I got to know keeping horses in all kinds of conditions. And I got really, really ill a few years ago and ended up stuck in bed for a few months. And when you're stuck in bed for a few months, you do end up rethinking your entire life. And I was really happy with what I was doing in my ecology career, my sort of nature communication and all of that kind of stuff. And I realised I wanted to help horses. And initially I thought I would go into horse behaviour and be a behaviour consultant. But on all the jobs that I was doing through that, I was finding that how the horse was kept was often the major player in that problem, in the behaviour that was coming out. And I realised a lot of those gaps could be filled by the ecology side of things that I had used as my bread and butter for years and years. And so that's how I sort of ended up combining the two.
Yeah, I first met Annabel at the National Equine Show last year, and the people I was with were like, "You have to meet Annabel. If anybody knows anything about grazing and how to manage land, it's her. You really need to get her involved with what you do." So this is why we're here today. Obviously, grazing welfare is a huge thing, a big topic in the news at the moment for yard owners. all aspects of equine welfare really seem to be under the spotlight at the moment. So from your perspective, Annabel, how important do you think the condition of grazing and ground should be on a yard? And how much of a priority do you think that this should be for yard owners?
Yeah, it's really important. I think it's becoming more of a thing on everyone's radars as well. You know, like we're saying in the news, there's all that stuff coming out with like RSPCA and World Horse Welfare, talking about the welfare of horses in the country, and also everything going on with the climate and land use. It's all become quite a pressing topic, and it's just getting more and more of a major thing. And we're starting to see those symptoms becoming worse and worse each year. You know, we're struggling more and more each year. And there are quite simple solutions to a lot of those problems that just take a small shift. And so I think it should be a top priority because it's going to save you, if you make some of the changes, it's going to save you masses of money, staff time, your own time, efforts. We'll talk about it all a bit more later, I'm sure. But yeah, it's a bit of a no-brainer, I think.
Yeah, there's definitely, for those that don't know, the RSPCA brought out a report at the end of February, and it was called something along the lines of the Equine Welfare Crisis Report. And in it, firstly, it was again recommending licensing for livery yards, which is a whole different subject. But one of the big focuses on that were the fact that so many ways that horses are kept doesn't provide either adequate space for turnout or adequate turnout, as in to be able to be out in the paddock and be free and graze like normal horses, because there's definitely a noticeable amount of yards that are adding in sort of all-weather turnout areas, but generally these are sand paddocks, tracks, or sort of smaller wood chip areas. There's not many that are actually able to offer full daytime grazing these days, mainly because of mud. And like you say, Annabel, with the climate changing, it does seem to be wetter and more prolonged some winters now. So I expect yard owners would like to know, is it actually possible to have a field that doesn't have mud? And basically, ultimately, some yards do still turn out. We know the fields get very poached and then they just kind of do a bit of maintenance and hope for the best the next year. But what if you're having horses out and your field is really muddy? Is there a way to remedy that, or are you basically just trashing your fields forevermore?
So, it is completely possible to have a field that is mud free all year round, anywhere at all. But the degree of difficulty in order to achieve that varies massively with things like the geology, the soil type that you've got, the number of horses you've got, the slope of the land. So while it might be a piece of cake for one yard in one part of the country, it might feel absolutely impossible at the other. It is possible, but it's going to take a very different approach in different places. So there's no one size fits all thing that's going to solve everything for everyone. It's about finding what works for your land, your horses, your setup. So before I go any further into all of it, I want everyone to remember that you're doing the very best with what you know, the support you have, and the resources available to you. So we can't really judge ourselves or others because we're doing our very best. I'm sure you're all doing your very best. And so increasing the amount of information available to you or shifting around your resources can really change how you can tackle the mud. So if we keep on with how we do things by having like that big arc of mud around our gates and a big arc of mud around the water, big circle of mud around hay, what we're doing is essentially very slowly digging a bit of a pond. So we are taking mud out of those areas on our clothes, in our horses' hooves, on their feathers if they're a bit fluffy, or just on their legs. We are also compacting the ground, which squeezes the oxygen out of it, and so that encourages anaerobic bacteria and things like that to start to take hold. You might notice it almost looks like an oil slick in the wet on the mud there. That's a bit of a sign of that. You might find that grass is struggling to grow in those areas. And if we just keep on with that, you're also allowing all this silt and whatever else to wash off into the waterways. You might get blocked up ditches, adding to the polluted river problem. So it's a whole big issue that kind of grows and grows and grows, and you might find it just gets worse and worse each year. So it's definitely something that we need to start zooming out and looking at the bigger issue. It's not just the gate's a bit muddy, it's how we are managing the whole setup. So prevention is better than cure. Yeah, so I'll maybe a bit later go into all of it because I don't want to overload everyone straight away.
Yes, as you say, I guess I always wonder how many yard owners, particularly people that don't own, I think if you own your land, it's probably slightly different. But I always wonder how many yard owners actually know or understand the type of soil, for example, they're on, and to know which problems they're more likely to experience. So if we just talk in a sort of a general way, I know as you say, it's very different. Everyone has a different type of land, different type of management, but for example, when you get to this time of year and the fields have got a bit poached from the winter turnout, if it is possible to have sort of some general tips, what is the best thing that yard owners can do to help their muddy areas? Like you say, it's always around gateways or on the fence lines, around the troughs, to try and help them best recover when it comes to this time of year. So obviously they're maximising the quality of grass for the
Yeah.
spring.
So at this point in time, if you are thinking, if I've just described your fields, you can do a bit of first aid. So you might have heard of mulching, which is where you use old hay sweepings and you put a thin layer so you can still see through it. You don't want it too thick over any bare areas. You don't want to shade out any grass that's existing, but just around those bare patches. And then the key thing is to then rest it. So that means allowing it to properly break down into the soil. You might see the seeds starting to germinate into into little small plants, and they need to grow so that they are strong enough that if you try to pull them out gently, they're not going to come out of the ground. They need to really take hold. And rest it long enough so that you have enough grass to kind of cover those bare patches. If it's been going on a long time, you're going to still have some bare patches that have bits of mulch over them, but the mulch is providing like a little blanket, a little mattress, to protect from erosion. It makes a nice little cozy atmosphere for the seedlings, and it feeds the soil as well as it breaks down. So that's a really good one that's free to do because everyone's got old hay lying around, and it's one that, as long as you pair it with that time of resting, is going to do something. And then sort of beyond that, we need to think about rotating our pastures and growing our grass longer. So this doesn't apply to sort of emergency laminitic overweight horses. That's a different kettle of fish. This is sort of just general management of fields. So what you can do is get a stick or an old welly and measure between 5 and 10 centimetres, depending how hardcore you want to go with it, and paint a red line or draw a red line. And then at sort of 15 to 20 centimetres, you want to draw a green line. And so what that does is you can go out into your field with your welly or your stick and you can measure the grass. And if it's at the red line, you need to take any horses off it and let it rest. Once it gets to the green line, then you can put horses back on it because you've got plenty of long grass. It's going to protect the ground as a bit of a mattress, and they're going to have lots to be getting on with. So you're going to see a slight reduction in hay bills. You'll find that they aren't going crazy for it if once they get used to having it long, they'll start to regulate what they're taking in, and it's sort of as above so below. So when you've got long grass, your grass plants allow are allowed to grow a longer root system. So instead of sort of scrabbling for nutrients in the shallow soil, they are reaching deep down into the soil and spreading further and getting nutrients from a larger area in the soil. They're able to bounce back quicker. They're able to recover better. So once you get into a bit of a cycle of that, you'll be able to manage it much easier. There's sort of a transition phase that's a bit difficult, but once you get into the swing of it, it just gets easier and easier.
Excellent. That sounds, I can see people just walking around with a stick looking like mad people in a field. Someone's just said, could you just repeat what the measurements were to mark on the stick?
Yeah, so at the bottom is a red line with between 5 and 10 centimetres. 5 is your absolute minimum. If you want to properly go for it, I'd say around 10. And then at 15 to 20 centimetres or longer, if you want to be a little bit more hardcore with it, depending on the grass species that you've got, you do the green line. So it's 5 to 10 at the bottom, 15 to 20 at the top with the green. And then you hold the grass up against your stick or your welly, just so you've got an idea, and do it in a few places around the field so you get a good picture for the whole field. And if you stick with that, yeah, it will make your life a lot easier with mud and all sorts of other things.
That's really interesting. So swinging to the other seasons now, because grazing in England seems to be muddy, spring grass, everything goes mad, and then the summer comes, and if it's a hot summer, it just turns into dust. So literally the opposite end of the spectrum from mud. When it comes to the summer, all of a sudden the fields go yellowy and don't have a lot in there. Some yards even finding that they end up putting hay out in the summer as well. So are there any preventative measures that yard owners can take to stop the sort of the bare dustiness of summer paddocks? I guess it's a balancing act.
Yeah, so just doing what I've said before with the grass will help that already. What we also need to think about is compaction. So if we have really compacted ground, it's going to create those dusty conditions. But additionally, in the horse world, we're sold drainage a lot. We're told to speed up water off our properties as fast as we can, to the point we're getting these waterproof yards. What we actually want is weatherproof yards, ones that can withstand loads of different weather conditions. So if we think about, say, in Africa, there's loads of projects where they do these half moon shaped holes that they dig out, and these catch water, even if it's very little rain, and it allows plants to grow around those pools. They might even just stay as sort of ditch looking things, and sort of green up the area. So translating that back to the UK, we have plenty of rain just at random intervals. We can think about what can we do on our yards to slow water down. So it might be that we look at our ditch setup, have a look at where the drainage goes. Maybe there's a ghost pond. So a ghost pond is a kind of dip in the landscape. It's a bit more to it, but basically it's where a pond used to be. And you could reinstate that pond because it's a very old pond that's been there a very long time in the past. If we reinstate it, you're sort of reinstating the natural water on your site. And that can kind of re-green up some things. Additionally, just greenery. Vegetation is your friend with mud and with dusty conditions. So think about putting in hedges, putting in trees wherever you can, and growing your grass longer. That's going to really hold on to any moisture in your soil. Looking after your soil health will just hold that moisture better in the soil. It won't sit on the top and fly off into wherever. It will just be held in the ground, and you'll find that your grazing is more stable. Your hay bales will drop because they've got all these options, all this grass, all these hedgerows to choose from. But it is really the starting point of all of that is growing your grass longer, slowing water down where it's suitable, and yeah, getting that greenery in.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I think probably more people worry about management over the winter than in the summer, but I suppose actually it's probably just as important because it's a complete cycle, if you see what I mean, of
Yeah,
seasons. Um,
yeah,
so when it comes to managing the grazing, obviously, although yard owners are the owners and managers of the yard, there's often quite a lot of kickback from liveries when it comes to changing paddocks, or if there's not enough grass, or if the fields have had to be sectioned off or have restricted turnout because of mud, for example. When it comes to client management, what sort of guidance can yard owners consider having in place, maybe in their contracts, or if they have a handbook for their clients that can help everybody kind of muck in and just do better grazing management in a sort of more participatory way?
yeah. So very often I will get yard owners come to me with that worry of if they're going to make any changes, they're going to upset clients, they're going to lose clients. Um, so the best thing to do when you're making a change is to show the benefits of that change. And so ways you can do that is maybe doing like a smaller experimental plot with it and doing it just with your horses or with a couple of people who are on board. You could do a bit of a yard trip out to somewhere where it's really working, and make a bit of a day of it, and then they can ask the questions to that person who's already had the success, um, and and start to get on board with it. You won't win everyone over, and I would also say, if you have total control over the management of your land, then you just need to be clear with what you're doing, and make it easy for everyone to join in. If people are sort of renting a bit and managing their own thing on their bit, and you want everyone to make a change, you need to make it really easy for them to join in. So if it means making a load of grass measuring sticks and having them out by the fields, if that means having a hay sweepings bag that is labelled hay sweepings, and putting it in the stable block for everyone to use, that just makes it really easy for people to adopt, because you can't expect people to jump on the bandwagon off their own backs. So yeah, so I would make it easy, show the benefits, and if you are going for big changes, you probably are going to lose some people, you probably are going to upset some people, but maybe those people aren't your ideal client anymore, and maybe you just need to market to the right people and use the right wording when you advertise your yard, or however you attract new clients, and position yourself as this sustainable yard or whatever kind of yard you are.
It's really good advice. I always think it's really important that yard owners shouldn't be led by their clients. Like you say, if they're the yard owner manager, they should be making the decisions and then having liveries that are fully on board with said decisions and not trying to battle them, because then that doesn't work for anybody. Um, so thinking about the very basics, I mean, I did a qualification in grass management many years ago as part of my equine HND, and all I remember is walking around a field, jabbing things into it, measuring stuff, and talking about nitrates. Um, and I wouldn't say I've retained a lot of the information that I learned. But from a basic point of view, what sort of knowledge should a yard owner have, whether they own or rent, of the ground? What knowledge should they have about soil type, understanding what type of grasses they have in the crop, so on and so forth?
Yeah, so the thing about, so with horses, most of us come into horses through learning to ride, learning to look after a horse. So it's very different from, say, farming or other kinds of land ownership where the land is kind of the main feature of it. With horses, it's another thing to think of, that is perhaps taken a bit of a back seat throughout the past of the horse world. It's not really something that's ever at the forefront. You know, you don't go to a riding lesson as a child and learn how to measure your grass. So yeah, so it's important to get a grip of what works for your land. I wouldn't go out and go think that you need to go and take an agronomy course or go and study ecology. What you need to learn is what works on your land and what works for you and what works for your horses. And if something isn't working, go out and research options that you could try that might work better. That's why I do what I do, is to fast track that process and then tell you what works and what might work a bit quicker. But yeah, so it's not a case of just trying to learn absolutely everything, because you'll get a headache, because you've already got everything else on your plate. You know, you're managing clients, you're managing broken down lorries and stable doors and fence posts and all sorts. So just figure out the best thing for you, and it's usually the cheapest and easiest option. Sometimes it's not, but quite often it is.
That's good. I think, yeah, so many people probably actually don't have any idea even what type of ground they're on. Is it possible? I'm sure it is, but I saw somebody ask this a couple of weeks ago. But is it possible for people to, for example, send off samples to find out the quality of the grass, like you would do for hay? Can you do that with grass as well?
Yeah, it's not so easy to find places that do it. And so any kind of testing, like soil testing, grass testing, is a bit like a blood test. It's a snapshot of what you have tested then. So when you do any samples, you're walking a W shape through your field. Say, for example, if you're doing a soil test, you are digging a little hole, putting it in a bucket, walk along a bit, dig a hole, put it in a bucket, mix it all together, send it off. So that's just testing what you have found on your walk. Things like, so there's a website that I'll send the link over for, that's called the Landish Soilscapes, which gives a rough idea. It's not exact, but it's a rough idea of what kind of soil type you can expect in your area, which can be really helpful, just giving you an inkling. So, you know, it might say that you've got slightly acidic, loamy soil. So you can, when you're looking for stuff that's going to work for you, you can look for stuff that's based on slightly acidic, loamy soil. When we send off these tests, quite often it will also be sent back with a load of advice, usually from an agronomist that hasn't seen your land, hasn't seen what you're doing with your land, has just seen some numbers, and they will probably try and sell you XYZ products that they have, which a lot of those things don't need to be changed. You'll be fighting an uphill battle if you're constantly having to spread lime or whatever, or magnesium or something, just to try and get it to this perfect neutral balance. There's so many habitats in the UK. We're such a diverse country. If we can learn to work with what we've got, we can just use a salt lick to address some of the imbalances. We can use local seed varieties, you know, from local situations. The great thing about a lot of horse properties is that quite a few that I've come across tend to not have had any changes made to them throughout history. So they come up with some really exciting plants that, you know, on farms and gardens and things would have been adjusted away, and conditions wouldn't have been suitable for them. So you can kind of find out what you've got. There's ways of getting seed from your own sites called doing green hay, where you just take a cut, collect it from a field, and transplant that cut the same day onto another field, and that will seed it with the stuff from the other field where you've got a really good field of stuff that you want. You can then seed it onto the other one, and all you need is the kit to do it, so you don't have to buy in any seed or anything. And then in terms of sort of soil improvers and stuff, the best thing is coming out the back end of your horse. So if you can put that back onto the soil, you're feeding the soil biome, um, and that takes care of a lot more than we give it credit for. We are very conditioned to apply all sorts of things to the soil, thinking that we know better, and actually, we know very little about this incredible world under our feet that can do incredible things.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, put muck spreading. Everybody loves a bit of muck spreading. You can tell where I live because I live in the middle of nowhere when it's muck spreading season. Carries on the wind. Um,
Yeah.
so obviously you work with a lot of different uh, people with their yards to try to help them improve their grazing, like you've been describing. Do you, obviously, a lot of yard owners are very budget conscious, and perhaps don't see things like investment in grazing, even though obviously there's long-term benefits. Do you believe that, for example, the yards that you work with, that there's a genuine improvement in what they can offer? So as in it's a worthwhile investment for them to be putting the time and effort in improving their grazing for the long term?
Yeah, so many yards that I've worked with have found savings in all kinds of strange ways. So, for example, one of my clients switched to a equicentral yard. Now she can manage it full livery on her own with 15 or so horses. She's also got two other businesses on the go. And it just she has so little to do every day on the yard of just running it because um, everything is so simplified. So an equicentral system, you've got like a central holding area, and then the pastures sort of radiate off that. And you open one pasture, and the horses can take themselves in and out from pasture to the holding area. And on that holding area, you have their water, hay, a bit of enrichment. So they go out and have a graze, maybe a little trot around or whatever. Then they will come back in to the holding area and then just chill out there, have a bit of hay, have a bit of water. So most of that hoof traffic is happening on that surfaced area. So what it does for her is that means she's got to do is check one field, one lot of horses with one lot of hay, or maybe two in that one area, one lot of water, and one lot of poo picking in that area. Then she's done. Until the next time she's not there mucking out loads of stables. And then what you can do with the stables is then rent them out to other businesses and convert them into studios and business units. So it is a really, really viable option to make some quite drastic changes. But even if you're making just small changes, more and more people are valuing turnout. And I think with any changes that happen off the back of this report from the RSPCA, more and more people are going to be looking for that year-round turnout, year-round grazing. And if you can offer that, you are miles ahead of the rest, and you are one of the premium yards that can offer that, particularly if it's really diverse, really nutritious grazing, and it's a well-run place because you have the grazing that allows you to get on with other things.
This time of year, there's always so many inquiries about people moving to yards, namely because they've been somewhere that's really muddy or that's been restricted over the winter, now trying to find somewhere that turns out. Because I guess the difference is you can have yards that do have turnout all through the winter, but there's a very big difference between turnout for the sake of turnout, where they're being put out in whatever the ground conditions are for the sake of stretching their legs, which actually can be detrimental because you could have strains or all sorts of things. And the difference between that, for example, and the difference between a yard that offers year-round turnout, but they actually graze, they actually have good quality grazing, the horses actually have something to do, and the yard owner isn't having to spend a fortune putting their hay or haylage out in the fields. But like I say, cost always does seem to be a massive hurdle for yard owners. So in not in all situations, obviously, but is there funding available in some situations? So perhaps in some areas, if you're improving or regenerating the land?
Yeah, so frustratingly, a big government scheme called the Sustainable Farming Initiative and Ecological Land Management were really, really good options for this. And annoyingly, not long ago, they pulled the plug on it without much warning. So hopefully something like that will come back out because that was really major in shifting a lot of farms and landowners into making these sustainable choices really easy and actually get funding for stuff like the fencing and stuff like that. However, there is still options out there. They're just a little bit more complex to find. So there's a thing called biodiversity net gain scheme. So this one, I won't go into a full-blown explanation of it because I'll be here for ages, but essentially developers have to show that they are creating a gain in biodiversity in their plans in order to get their planning permission. And sometimes they can't achieve that on site, so they have to buy units off site. And so what some landowners can do, and if you have the space to do it, it can be quite a good option. It locks you into a bit of a 30-year management plan, but it is for improving biodiversity, and it can do some great things. But it's one to think carefully about and get some advice on. Other things, other funding options, so various charities, so like Woodland Trust have the More Trees and More Hedges funds, where they will fund, I think it's 70 or 75%, it's something like that, of installing some hedges and trees on your site, and they will also provide advice on that. But it is a very, very popular scheme, so you have to think well ahead with it and put a good plan in. But that's a really good one for if you're wanting to green up the edges of your fields with a bit of hedgerows. And then other things like local authorities, environmental charities sometimes have funding pots for looking after certain types of habitats. So if it's good to try and figure out what you've actually got, because you might have something quite locally important that could be protected, and you could have lots of support in protecting that, both in terms of advice, on the ground support, and funding for certain things.
Yeah, that's good. I've seen the actually on the yard owner group on Facebook quite a few times. I've seen different yard owners put that they've been the recipient of the tree and hedge giving out, and some of them do it every year, I think, and they're just gradually building a hedgerow around whatever the quota is that they get each year. So yeah, like you say, there's some more localized things as well. So it's always worth looking into your local authority, local council, what have you, as well, to see if they have anything, because obviously they're not always nationally published, and some of them can be a little bit on the quiet side because some people don't like giving things away. So yeah, that's a really good point as well. I know that you've touched on poo briefly, but I was just going to see what your opinion is on poo picking, because obviously when it comes to worming and what have you, there's lots of different recommendations and lots of different ways that yard owners deal with it, whether it's enforcing poo picking or harrowing. But when it comes to land management, what do you think is the best poo solution?
So it really depends on your situation. So if you've got a steady herd, they don't really go out many other places, they have had a steady worm count for a long time, then you could think about leaving it, or leaving some of it and harrowing it in or kicking it around or whatever, if that's what works for you. But on other yards, maybe where people go out and compete and the horses ingest hay at other yards, we need to think about the biosecurity of that, and if there's sort of a bit of a higher turnover, or if you have horse holidays on your site, you need to think about whether that's a safe option if you could risk a mass worm infestation, because a worm can crawl away from a poo quite far. The people to speak about specifically about your worm situation are Westgate. This isn't a plug. I've had some great conversations with them about that sort of thing. They really know their stuff. But so if you're worm counting, it's a bit all over, or you've got new horses coming in, that's where we need to be poo picking, but we can compost the poo. And if you compost it correctly, so all of it is getting up to temperature, I think it's about 65, don't quote me on that. It's about 65 for about 3 days. That way it will kill off any worm eggs or juveniles in the poo. It will also supposedly, the research so far is a bit minimal, but it will supposedly break down any worming chemicals as well, and any medicine as well. So if you've got competition horses and you need to worry about that as well, it should break down most things. But the longer and warmer the better for the compost, and if you can get it covered over, if you can have it in a 3-bay system so that you're turning it into the next one, just like gardeners would. That way you're also killing off any seeds potentially. Some will still survive, but some of them will be killed off. And then that stuff, the compost that you've got, is actually really great for your land, because it's kind of like the perfect food for some of your microbes to enjoy. Yeah, so composting is sort of the gold standard of it, whether you're worried about it or not. And if you can get some good composting going, it also means that you are using your poo and you are not paying a farmer to take it away, which is more money saved.
Yeah, actually, for those that don't know, Westgate do quite a lot of resources, so we've got quite a lot of documents and information from them on the hub as well. And they have actually been focusing on muck heaps recently. They've got quite a lot of good resources when it comes to managing your muck heaps and things like, I suppose, on a balance between land management and worming management, is that a lot of yard owners, for example, for the ease for liveries, perhaps more than themselves, have their poo picking heap in the field that they're poo picking, which is really counterproductive. So if anyone wants to look up any more on Westgate Labs, they've got quite a lot of information on there about managing muck heaps. So that kind of ties in with what you're saying, Annabel, about, you can compost and reuse it, but importantly, you have to consider the biosecurity and the worming element primarily. You were talking just now about equicentral yards. So you don't just help grazing, as in when people think of grazing, they think of paddocks with grass in. But you help all sorts of yards, don't you? So do you have much involvement with the development of equicentral, obviously, because you've mentioned that, but there's a lot of track livery yards cropping up at the moment as well. Is that the sort of thing that you give guidance on as well?
Yeah, definitely. So it's sort of, there's a massive, huge spectrum, and anytime I do a course, I kind of start off with this massive spectrum of horse keeping, because people think it's just field, track, this, that, and actually there's this huge array of things that we can do to look after our horses depending on the situation. So yeah, so tracks are becoming really popular recently, particularly sort of tracks for rehabbing horses. I think they're really useful in managing laminitis and all kinds of problems, actually. But what we need to be careful of is a track system isn't just a thin corridor of electric fence. A track system is a whole concept. So you've got to think about, do you want mud all year round, or do you want to put the planning permission in and put some surfacing in, at least some of it? Or do you need to think about other options for having a track system? And also, if you're putting in a track system, you might attract a different kind of client who might be a little bit more last chance saloon, a little bit more emotionally challenging for you. It might be a little bit more of a difficult case that you're taking on, and you need to decide if that's something that you have the bandwidth for and the capacity for, because I think any surface track owner that does rehab will tell you it's very, very draining and very heavy on your emotional well-being. But tracks can be a really great option as long as they're done carefully, but you can incorporate a lot of sort of sustainable options to help you managing your track in a way that's going to benefit horses' welfare. So you can add hedgerows, you can add dead hedges, which is basically just sort of dead sticks and logs and things, and it can be as fancy or not fancy as you like, or hedge laying, adding trees. There's once you start thinking about it, you can apply all of this enrichment stuff to any kind of setup. It's not just tracks. But yeah, so tracks are really great. Equicentral systems, I've kind of explained the concept of them. I'm a massive fan of equicentral systems. They are probably the lowest effort once you've got it going of any kind of setup, because you've got that central thing. The horses are taking themselves in and out, so you don't need a person in the way to do that. Yeah, that's probably the easiest one. Tracks are great because you're not worrying about some things, but you are still poo picking and putting hay out on the track all the time. Some cool yards that I've seen, I'm quite a fan of them now, are hybrid systems. So you have a track as your central holding area, and you have your pastures coming off your track. And I like that because with the holding area on an equicentral system, if you do it too small, they can't really move around much. And if that's something that you're concerned about, and if with unpredictable weather and everything, if we're finding that we're having to hold our horses on that area more and more, offering them lots of movement and enrichment, and different things to interact with on a track, that's quite beneficial to the horse, because then you can rest your pastures far longer because you know that they are doing their own thing on the track for longer. And there's a few sort of hybrid setups popping up, and they're really, really promising. There's one that I ran a course out of that's a surface track with equicentral system on it. She still has stables. It's like a rehab situation, but it's amazing what's happening with the pastures because she can use the track when she needs to protect it.
It's really interesting all the different types of yards that have sort of been invented recently,
Yeah.
because it's come a long way from sort of just, oh, you're a DIY yard or a park yard or a full yard. There's so many variations on like equicentral, track livery, hybrid livery, that I think there's so many options, especially for people that don't have the ability to have stabling, for example, but still want to be able to offer something. And definitely people are enjoying the ability to have yards where they can put their horse, where they've got the freedom and the natural living, as opposed to stabling, restricted turnout. There's a question from Emma that I'm going to ask. It might be a bit specific, but you might have some generic information. It might be something that she needs to contact you about because it's specific. She says, do you have any recommendations for yards in an area of outstanding natural beauty or in a natural landscape who want to create a surfaced holding yard but are restricted in putting in the surfacing, presumably because of where they are?
Yeah, so mud mats are quite a good workaround with that. They don't provide the softness of a surface, so horses are less likely to want to lie down on it. And if they are shod, it's a very slippery experience. So it's more for barefoot horses, but that's something that kind of I've found people that go all in with tracks or equicentral systems shift to barefoot as well. So yeah, mud mats. You can kind of get around it a little bit by adding straw on top of the mud mats as a bit of a, well, horses tend to pee on it because they don't like the splash of the mats. But you can offer like straw bits, sand if you're allowed, but usually not. Or better still, using existing surfacings, getting really creative. Because if you already have a yard, you might already have like a bit of a concreted area, so you could use a bit of that, and maybe get creative with some stables and convert them into a bit of a field shelter. And sometimes that's just a case of removing a partition and having the doors open, as long as you've got horses that are going to cope with that. Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one, and it's sort of specific to the place and what's allowed there. But yeah, mud mats are really useful for that.
Someone else has just said, can you use wood chip for a holding area or as part of a track system?
Sometimes it does tend to go a bit smelly and sludgy, like it disappears into the ground if you've got quite deep, particularly like clay soils. It tends to squidge in. Um, I've seen it work in some places. Um, Others really, really not. So it's situational. Another one, one of my clients is experimenting with is cockle shells,
All right.
which if you live near the coast, is usually a very, very cheap option. And they tend to like crush down really small, but they're not sharp. Um, Yet to see the effect of them, and again, some areas might not permit that. But if it's a goer, it's worth a try if you're really desperate and you can't afford to go all out with the surfacing. Again, very highly individual.
Yeah, because I guess even with things like wood chip, they can be a huge variant in what people class as wood chip. Because if
Yeah,
you're going for sort of the small, not shavings, but more so, but they would obviously break down very quickly, especially if they're out all the time, compared to the massive sort of pine chunks that you get, which obviously last longer. So I guess yeah, very
yeah,
dependent on exactly what products used as well.
yeah,
So we're going to move away from grass and stuff now. And something that somebody else asked if I could ask you, was obviously at the moment costs have been rising, not at the moment, for all the moments for about the last 3 years, I think. And obviously people are looking at ways of cutting costs for their yard, especially if they're like full livery and they're including hay or haylage. So people are trying to not cut corners, that's not the right thing, but to be more cost considerate when they're sourcing things like bedding and forage. So when it comes to hay, if somebody's thinking of trying a new supplier, I've seen it many times where they've gone to a new supplier that is cheaper and then their hay turns up and then the liveries complain because it's very dusty or because it's very dry or there's not a lot of quality to it. Um, what would you say yard owners should be looking for when they're sourcing hay or forage for the yard?
yeah. So again, it's sort of paired with a load of other changes. You know, if you are adopting an equicentral system or something like it, you know, it's not all or nothing. You can have elements of it. You would automatically be having more grass in your fields. You'd have hedgerows for horses to go for. So um, many people find that their hay bills shrink massively from that, and they don't really have bedding costs apart from, you know, a couple of stables for veterinary procedures and whatever. So you can find massive savings in that way. But in terms of looking for suppliers, conditions are always quite unpredictable in the UK. And with the sort of warm, damp autumns that we've been having, any late cut hay has been getting quite mouldy. And yeah, it's really unpredictable and it's quite hard for hay suppliers to get the window of opportunity quite right. So some of them are going for much, much earlier cuts, which can be quite sugary for any laminitic horses and things. So if it's something that you are worried about, then tested hay, you know, suppliers that already test their hay and you can see it, is a really good green flag. Also, suppliers that are really open and allow you to come and look at the fields, or they're really open about what's in their hay, that's a really big green flag. Diverse hay is usually better. Now, this one doesn't have much research backing yet, but in humans, we're supposed to eat 30 different plants a week for good gut health. And I'm sure with horses, it's supposed to be, who knows, far more than that. So if we can have quite diverse hay, that's going to benefit our horses because they can mooch through the hay, they can pick through it, and get all the different benefits from that hay. And then another thing to mention is some hay suppliers now are buying what they can at auction if they run out with what they got. So it's if you can find ones that don't do that, it's a bit easier because sometimes stuff at auction you have no idea where it's come from. Usually, if hay is quite dusty, it might be that they are cutting it quite low to the ground and getting a bit of dirt up from the ground. It's a really, really, really variable one. I've helped out a little bit on a project that was looking at different hays and testing them and the differences between them, and it was really tricky to figure out what was going on where. So I would say if you can have a couple of local suppliers, particularly if you want to use the hay sweepings on your land that have quite diverse hay, try and find out what species they have and see if it's similar to what you've got, and then when you're spreading the seed, it's going to be appropriate. But I'd say in this wacky climate, I would also keep in your back pocket a couple of numbers of people that are slightly further afield. So should a disaster happen locally, say if you're in an area that floods regularly or you get fires regularly, I'd say it's quite wise to have a contact of someone where they have very different conditions, just in case, so that you have a backup supplier that might be able to get some hay to you should it all go a bit wrong locally. But that's sort of very worst case scenario thinking.
It's a good idea, though. I bet many people don't actually think of that. If you have all of the farmers in the same area, or effectively to an extent, they're all subject to the same climatic conditions. So that's a really good idea. There was just a question about hay. Is clover good or not? And in hay as well. I think they mean in fields and in hay.
So, well, I could go off on quite a big one on clover. So,
Uh,
so clover is very popular with farmers because it fixes nitrogen. Basically, it feeds the soil with nitrogen. So if you pull up a clover plant, look at its roots, there's like these pinky, lumpy growths on the bottom of the roots. That is where the bacteria is in there. It's sort of inside the roots, and it's part of the nitrogen cycle, which I won't go into. But basically, it means that it increases the amount of nitrogen available to the plants around it. Now, clover loves growing in compacted conditions, which is why you might see more of it growing around your gateways where grass might not be. You might find it grows in kind of slightly wetter patches in your fields. You can kind of see sort of roots of it around the field where tractors go and things like that. It's not necessarily bad. It's not necessarily good. There is a type of clover that is being found to be associated with cases of toxicity. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but I can send a link over about it. And for laminitic and sort of EMS high risk horses, it's kind of been thought of quite bad because it's quite high in potassium and it's proteins and all sorts. It's so if you've got a field that's just clover, then yeah, I'd say it's probably bad. But if you've just got a little bit here and there, you're never going to eradicate it completely unless you go full chemical warfare on it.
Okay, thank you. Good answer. So to finish, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you this question, and then you can just tell us a bit about what you do in terms of the services that you offer, and then we're going to do a question and answer. There's a couple of questions that have been asked in the chat that I'll do afterwards, and then if anyone else has any. But to finish, so if anybody, whether they're watching now, whether they're going to watch this in the future, what is the one thing that yard owners should take away from our chat and from everything that you've shared that is something that they can think, right, that should be my first step in trying to make sure I'm doing the best that I can for my grazing?
Okay, so I'd say so. to start with, we've barely scratched the surface on anything today, and I could go on for ages about all of it. But I think the key thing is, um, if we rest your fields based on the growth of the grass rather than the calendar, that's gonna sort of start the shift. As long as your horses can cope with it. If your horses are suddenly starting to get really footy or really fat, you need to halt and just rethink, and have a look at using the all weather options a little bit more to begin with. We don't want to suddenly grow our grass really long, chuck our horses out, and they've been starved in a stable for a few weeks in order for the grass to grow. That's a recipe for disaster. So if we can introduce it gradually, and just start growing our grass a little bit longer and not letting it get so short and giving it the time to rest, I'd say that's a really good starting point, whatever you're doing.
And a stick with stripes on.
Yeah.
That's really good. Like you say, obviously, because I wanted to make sure that today was kind of relevant to everybody rather than going to, like, as you said earlier when we were talking, just going down rabbit warrens about things. Obviously, like you say, a lot of it is very specific to each individual yard, each individual landscape, where they're situated. So, do you just want to say a bit about the sort of services that you offer and the support that you can offer? And then I'll just do these couple of we'll do the question and answer sessions just so that people know the scope of everything that you can offer on a more detailed basis.
Yeah. Yeah. So I do courses. So we sort of do day courses on specific topics. Sometimes they're a little bit more general, sometimes it's specifically about track systems or equicentral systems or whatever. The next one I've got actually is on Saturday in Somerset. We do have a couple of spaces, so I'll send a link to that if anyone wants to join. And yeah, so I do courses all over the country, and hopefully beyond further down the line. And I also offer consultancy both remote and in person. So I can come up to your yard, you send me any maps, soil tests, past advice from, if you've had any planning permission, all of that sort of stuff, so I can have a good look before I come out. And then we go and we walk around your whole site, have a look at where the problems are, and think about some solutions that would be relevant to your site. I also do sort of design work if you're like, I don't know how to turn this into an equicentral system and a track system of my dreams. I can help you design that. And then also I can do all of this remotely as well. I also do sort of area visit discounts if it's a little bit further afield, because I'm based in Oxfordshire, which is kind of central, but I have a toddler, so I have to coordinate when I go.
Yeah, that's good. So I will include a link for Annabel's website and information so that you can see what she gets up to, because she's all over the place doing talks and stuff. Right, there's a couple of questions that I'll ask. People can put their cameras on now if they like, or if you have any other questions, then I will ask them as well. Put them in the chat or give us a wave. I'll just work through the couple here. Zoe said, is it better to have a surfaced track system instead of a natural surface? And then secondly, are track systems considered a concern for ground compaction or impacts on surrounding land?
Yeah, so a surface track is quite a permanent decision, obviously, but so is an unsurfaced track, because you are basically putting a higher density of horses on a smaller area, and they're using it constantly. So it kind of, if you've got really sandy soil, you can kind of get away with it a little bit more. But in a lot of places, I do see it's just sort of like a mud scar on the landscape. I've seen some people have quite a lot of success with partially surfaced, so they're just reinforcing the thinner points and the turning points, because a turning horse puts more pressure on the ground than just a horse moving forwards. So I've seen some tracks hold up a lot better when they're sort of got a little bit of surface in the corners and then maybe less so. Surface tracks are kind of a good alternative to building a whole entire concreted yard, because you can kind of minimize the amount of space that is this waterproof surface, and you can also sort of green up around the edges. We've got to think of solutions, whether we like it or not, to, there's so many horses in the country. We can't carry on as we are, so we've got to sort of look at the new options that are available and see whether they work and how they can fit into the landscape. And I'd say a lot of surface tracks done well seem to minimize the impact on the surrounding areas. Have I answered the second part to that question? I can't remember.
So, so yeah, I mean, anything like if anyone has anything specific, they can obviously contact you anyway. Joyce has asked, when it comes to sort of normal grass maintenance, do you have any general recommendations regarding calendars for harrowing, rolling, weeding, feeding, for example?
Okay, so roughly, firstly, I'd say rolling doesn't usually need to happen. Usually, a harrow will sort out any ruts. That's a very generalist term, and if it's specifically you get really rutted ground, and or if you're putting some seed and you want to press it into the ground. But harrowing, again, it's a little bit overdone in some places, and if you're just sort of scratching the surface, it might not actually do a lot, especially if you're pulling it with quite a heavy machine. You might be compacting more with the machine that you're driving it with than what you're trying to undo with the harrow. And I'd also say, when you rotate your grazing a lot, the ground sort of bounces back better, because the horse's hooves will naturally stir up the ground a little bit. And if you've got quite a healthy soil biome and you've got a lot of grass growing longer, it protects it quite a bit, and you'll have a lot of worm action, and fungal action in the soil that will be helping that structure. So you might not need to harrow as much. Sorry, this isn't very calendary, is it? So traditionally it would be very much you harrow this time, you roll this time, you seed this time. And actually what works better with the land is looking at what is needed at the time and going, actually, do I need to seed this? What you could do, and save a lot of money on seed, is letting one field go through its whole cycle of going fully to seed and dropping its seed before then grazing it, because then it's reseeding itself, and then doing that for another field the next year. So you don't have to worry about seeding so much. And if you're doing a bit of mulching in the muddy areas, then you're reseeding those bits a little bit, and you can sort of play it by ear a little bit. So when the ground isn't too wet, isn't too dry for a harrow, so you're not going to damage it with your wheels. You're not going to tear up the ground with your harrow, and it's very rutted, or you've had to put the horses on a bit longer than you wanted to, then you can go ahead and harrow it then, perhaps in the spring or autumn, whenever that's needed. But we don't need to go mad harrowing or rolling anything. We can take a slightly more hands-off approach, and it should regenerate a little bit easier.
I think that's the thing now, where the weather's been changing so much, that kind of traditionalist calendar of grazing maintenance has almost become not fully defunct, because there's still seasons, obviously, but as in it, like you say, it's a lot more about looking and seeing what you've already got, rather than going, right, okay, it's the 1st of April, we need to do this, that, and the other today because it's the 1st of April. So like you say, like the same for yards. Traditionally, it was always like April, horses go out 24/7 in the summer. October they come in, but it doesn't really work like that now, because sometimes the drier spells sort of at the end of the summer, beginning of the autumn, last longer, whereas actually it can be wetter this time of year, and no year seems to be consistent whatsoever. Just another question on harrowing. How long do you think you should leave horses off the ground after you've harrowed? She said she's been told 6 to 8 weeks, but some people seem to put horses straight back on.
Yeah, so the risk with this is things like diseases from contact with the soil that's been exposed. And also the ground, obviously, it's been, if you imagine it as a living thing, it's been scratched. So it's got to do some recovering. So yeah, so if you can do it at the end of a rotation, so once the horses have come off it, you're contending with shorter grass because they have grazed it down for you. And then you're going to rest it until the grass is long enough, which means the ground's healing up, and also the horses are going to be eating the grass at the length where they're not going to be getting into contact with all that soil at the ground level. That makes sense.
Yeah, completely. Um, Another question. What do you think the best horse to land ratio should be? Obviously, if you go on like the BHS and stuff, or ever since I ever knew anything about horses, it's either an acre or an acre and a half per horse. But what do you think from a grazing management point of view?
So again, I'm sorry to do this, but it's really dependent on the grass, the soil type, the kind of horses you have. I think it's really easy to forget that the breed of horse has quite a bearing on what their impact is. Shetland's going to have a very different impact on the ground compared to a 17-hand Irish Draft. So it depends on what horses you've got, what kind of land you've got. But I would say that Pony Club or BHS horse to an acre or acre and a half is very generalist and usually actually not enough, especially during like a transition period. So as I said, if you are transitioning to this longer grass setup and a more sort of natural way of the horses being kept, you'll go through a transition period of a few years where things like certain plants will take over, and you might feel like you're not getting anywhere because suddenly docks all popped up everywhere after you've spread muck for the first time the following year, or whatever, or you have a thistle overload. So I would keep a smaller stocking rate during that transition period while you get to know your land, while your land goes through its processes, and as it starts to plateau, if it ever does, you can sort of play with it and see if you can add another horse in, and how long does your field setup last. Are you getting through it in a week or is it taking 2 weeks? You can kind of measure it again by the length of the grass and how quickly it comes back, and are you going through a whole cycle of all your fields and your first field still isn't ready yet. That's probably a sign that you need to change something, either in how you manage the grass or how many horses are on it.
Okay. Yeah, so, but I think a lot of questions are a bit like, how long is a piece of string?
I know. I'm
Um,
sorry I can't give anything definitive.
no, well, I've learned a lot today, and I thought I knew a fair amount about grazing management. Does anybody else have any other questions? You can put your camera on, or give us a wave, or pop in the chat. I think we've covered quite a lot. Um, but no, I can't see any other questions cropping up. As I say, I'm going to send an email out probably this afternoon. If not this afternoon, then tomorrow. And I'll put Annabelle's email in there and her website. So if anyone has anything really specific, definitely take those direct to Annabelle, and she can give you a personalized, non how long is a piece of string answer. But thank you everyone for giving up time over lunchtime. And thank you very much to Annabelle for giving up her time to come and talk to us all. If you have any questions, then yes, by all means, just reply either to me or to Annabel, and I'll send that out. Yes, I will, Emma, put the link on Livery List. I'll put it so that it's on the hub so that it can be downloaded off the hub, and I'll send a link to that rather than just a recording as a whole so that you can send it to whoever you like, and Annabel can tell everybody in the world how to do their grazing. Right. Thank you, Annabel. Thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
coming, and continue all the good yard management, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.